New origin story for Tyrannosaurus rex suggested by fossil. Researchers say the species they named Tyrannosaurus mcraeensis predated the dinosaur era's great predator. A team of researchers have announced the discovery of a new species of Tyrannosaurus from New Mexico, one that appeared in the fossil record 5 million to 7 million years before the familiar tyrant lizard. Their research, published Thursday in the journal Scientific Reports, suggests a new chapter could be added to the origin story of Tyrannosaurus rex. When staff from the New Mexico Museum of Natural History and Science collected the partial skull of a large adult Tyrannosaurus from the Elephant Butte Reservoir in the state in the 1980s, they initially assumed the fossils belonged to T-Rex. But when Sebastian Dahlman, a paleontologist at the museum, began working on the specimen in 2013, he noticed subtle but consistent differences between it and other T-Rex skulls. Rather than the deep bone-crushing jaws of an adult T-Rex, the lower jaw of the reservoir specimen looked more slender. Its teeth were different, and the animal lacked the prominent ridge of bone found behind T-Rex's eye, Mr. Dahlman said. Scientists estimate that the animal was approximately 39 feet long, around the same length as an adult T-Rex. T-Rex fossils are believed to be 66 million to 68 million years old, the period recorded in the Hell Creek Formation of the Plains States, said Spencer Lucas, paleontology curator at the museum and an author on the paper. When the fossil was initially discovered, researchers initially assumed the rock layers that produced it, the McRae Formation of New Mexico, belonged to the same period. But the team's dating of the rocks now suggests that the McRae Formation was 5 million to 7 million years older than Hell Creek, and that the specimen they found came from an earlier relative. Most species are not around for more than 1 million years, Drive. Lucas said. The age argument really is matched by the anatomy. The researchers argue that this is enough evidence to conclude that the skull belongs to a distinct species, which they've named Tyrannosaurus mcraeensis after the formation where the specimen was found. Over the past few years, some scientists have argued that certain fossils assigned to T-Rex actually represented new species, and have faced serious pushback from other scholars. Researchers in the field have generally been reluctant to split apart such an iconic and well-studied species without overwhelming evidence. This is going to get a lot more scrutiny than the average newly named dinosaur, said Dave Hone, a paleontologist at Queen Mary University of London who was not involved with the paper. But he and other outside researchers have reacted more warmly to T. mcraeensis than to other purported tyrannosaur discoveries, noting that the authors have made a reasonable and compelling case. That the remains seem both outside the usual range of variation for T-Rex and comfortably separated in time strengthens the argument, said Thomas R. Holtz Jr., a paleontologist at the University of Maryland. The find also has interesting implications for the timeline of Tyrannosaurus evolution, Drive. Holtz said. Throughout the late Cretaceous period, Tyrannosaurus relatives ranged across what is today western North America, from Alaska to Mexico. By the last few million years of the dinosaurs' reign, however, the larger T-Rex replaced these lineages. Since the closest known relatives of Tyrannosaurus are from Mongolia, Drive. Holtz said, some researchers argued that Tyrannosaurus represented a specific group that crossed a land bridge from Asia. But the new discovery suggests that the Tyrannosaurus lineage appeared in North America 5 million to 7 million years earlier than expected, and may have originated in the southwest before spreading north. There's obviously more going on than just a move north given that we have the Asian lineages too, Drive. Hone said. Big tyrannosaurs were getting around. If Tyrannosaurus did appear in the southwest, the team suggests, the genus's giant size may have evolved to prey on the enormous herbivores found in the region, like Alamosaurus, a sauropod that grew up to 100 feet long, and Sierraceratops, an earlier relative of Triceratops. But what caused such a landscape of comparative giants to appear in a specific region of North America remains a mystery. "I think we need to spend more time looking at the Southwest," said Nick Longrich, a paleontologist at the University of Bath in England and an author on the paper. "There are a lot of poorly studied areas where we're going to find new things." Tyrannosaurus rex is the most iconic dinosaur. Its skeletons hold pride of place in museums around the world, and sell for millions of dollars at auction, and a bounty of relatively complete specimens have made it the most thoroughly studied dinosaur in the world. But in a new paper published Tuesday in Evolutionary Biology, 3 researchers argue that the animal we currently call Tyrannosaurus rex should actually be split into 3 separate species, with T-Rex being joined by 2 cousins they named Tyrannosaurus imperator, or the emperor, and Tyrannosaurus regina, the queen. This paper is likely to rock the paleo community, and the public that is so used to good old T-Rex, said Gregory Paul, an independent paleontologist and paleo artist and author on the paper. Tyrannosaur experts largely disagree. Thomas Carr, a paleontologist at Carthage College in Kenosha, Wisconsin, calls the evidence for multiple species vanishingly weak. Another paleontologist removed himself as an author of the paper before it moved to publication. And curators at museums with Tyrannosaurus specimens that would be affected by these reclassifications say they aren't going to rename anything based on the proposal. But even if children's imaginations never end up filled with the sharp teeth and tiny arms of 3 types of Tyrannosaurus, the premise put forward by Mr. Paul and his colleagues highlights an assortment of tensions in dinosaur paleontology. One is that naming dinosaur species is a subjective process, and each new species description is more of an argument than a declaration. Some researchers think that the idea of multiple Tyrannosaurus species has merit but say that splitting apart a species as famous and well-studied as Tyrannosaurus rex requires a high standard of evidence. Whether Mr. Paul is ultimately proved right, he wouldn't be the first researcher unaffiliated with formal institutions to shake up a consensus in the field, or the first to potentially bite off more than he can chew. The name game. Scientific names are split between genus and species. Tyrannosaurus is a genus, which is theoretically capable of holding multiple species. As yet, it has only one, Tyrannosaurus rex. This might sound simple, says David Hone, a paleontologist at Queen Mary University of London. But there's actually no universally consistent agreement for what constitutes a species. To separate them in living animals, scientists generally rely on anatomy, the color of a bird's feathers or the specific traits of bones, as well as genetic evidence. But separate species can and do interbreed, and animals of the same species at different ends of a very large geographic range can vary a startling amount from one another. In the absence of prehistoric DNA, dinosaur paleontologists must rely on the anatomical details of fossilized bone, which can be found at different growth stages or varying levels of completeness. This can lead to headaches, like scientists assigning multiple names to the same animal, as with Brontosaurus, which was junked for more than a century before the name was revived in 2015. But Tyrannosaurus rex has been a remarkably stable name. Discovered in 1902, the animal is the last and largest of the many, smaller tyrannosaurs that preceded it in the dinosaur era. Its fossils have been found primarily in the Hell Creek Formation, a band of 66-million-year-old rocks that records the last million years of the dinosaurs. Rain and is found in parts of Montana, Wyoming, South Dakota and North Dakota. Long known from only 2 decent specimens, Mr. Paul said, Tyrannosaurus rex largely sailed through the decades without major taxonomic revisions. But as dinosaur fossil collecting boomed in the 1990s, newly found T-Rex skeletons trickled into museums. Their proportions showed a remarkable amount of individual variation, and some researchers argued that they fell into 2 groups: the bulky, robust form, and the relatively svelte, gracils. Some scientists argued it was evidence of major differences between females and males of the species, said Thomas Holtz, a paleontologist at the University of Maryland who specializes in tyrannosaurs. Others said it was simply an unusual degree of individual variation. But some researchers toyed with a third possibility, that Tyrannosaurus was a genus with more than one species. One of those researchers was Mr. Paul. While Mr. Paul lacks a formal degree in paleontology, he has a long history in the field, and has written or been a co-author of over 30 scientific papers. He has proposed new genera and species for other dinosaurs, too. An argument he made about Brachiosaurus was broadly embraced. Another one he made about Iguanodon wasn't. His work also influenced Michael Crichton, the author of the novel, Jurassic Park, as well as the makers of the movie based on it. In 2010, Mr. Paul and others began working on the question of T-Rex's identity. They gathered anatomical measurements from 38 existing specimens, and assessed them according to a pair of anatomical traits: the relative proportions of the femur and the presence, or absence, of two sets of chisel-like front teeth in their lower jaws. They also compared the Tyrannosaurus specimens, which were collected from across North America, to specimens of dinosaurs that most likely belong to one species, such as the 14 Allosaurus specimens collected from the University of Utah's Cleveland Lloyd Dinosaur Quarry. The T-Rexes, they said, showed significantly wider variation in body proportions, suggesting they might belong to multiple species. They found some of the specimens difficult to classify, but 26 seemed to group into three types, Mr. Paul said. One robust form from early in the Hell Creek with two sets of incisors in its lower jaws, and a robust and gracile form from later with only one incisor set. These three forms, Mr. Paul and his colleagues concluded, were probably different enough from one another, and appeared over a sufficient length of time, to warrant separate names. Therefore, the earliest, bulky Tyrannosaurus to show up in the Hell Creek received the name Tyrannosaurus imperator, emperor tyrant lizard, which then, over the course of 1 million to 2 million years, split into the robust Tyrannosaurus rex and the newly named, comparatively slender Tyrannosaurus regina, tyrant lizard queen. That proposed evolutionary trajectory, from one tank-like population to another relatively light one, matches ecosystems earlier in the Cretaceous period that were dominated by Tyrannosaurus relatives, Mr. Paul said. In that period, bruisers like Daspletosaurus coexisted with long-legged hunters such as Gorgosaurus. According to Dr. Holtz, such an idea is entirely plausible, but proving it will require support from future finds. It's a testable hypothesis, as any statement of species identity should be. Drive. Holtz said. With additional new specimens, we can see if specimens they didn't include or we haven't found yet are consistent with this suggestion, or if they reject it. While Drive. Holtz felt the author's case would be more convincing if the different species they describe were organized more chronologically in specific rock layers. He noted that the Hell Creek Formation contains other examples of species divergence. Other fossils found there led to a general agreement that there was more than one species of Triceratops. Drive. Holtz said. And there's a possibility that the hadrosaurs and dome-headed Pachycephalosaurus found at the top of the formation differ significantly from those at the bottom. At the same time, in the same place, the same size classes of organisms are going through a succession of species. Drive. Holtz said. It's not inconceivable that Tyrannosaurus did so as well. Bones to pick. Urs took a less positive stance. A major problem with the study is that the femur proportions of all three proposed species overlap rather than showing clear separations, said Jingmei O'Connor, associate curator of fossil reptiles at the Field Museum in Chicago. The same is true of the proposed periods of time in which they existed. To her, that suggests a continuous spectrum of change, arbitrarily split into three groups. Not the distinct differences you'd expect to see in three species. The diagnoses provided for each species are incredibly vague, using words like, usually, and, generally, drive. O'Connor said. Even in well-preserved specimens, the authors are unable to refer them to a specific species. The proposed species groupings also don't necessarily match existing anatomical data, Drive. Carr of Carthage College said. After reading the study, Drive. Carr compared its conclusions to a massive analysis of T-Rex he performed in 2020, which included every existing Tyrannosaurus specimen. He found no significant correlation between the 2020 data and the types Mr. Paul's team described. 4 of those specimens have perfect skulls. Dr. Carr said. They should be able to tell species apart if they have perfect skulls, and they can't do it. Similar concerns led Philip Currie, a paleontologist at the University of Alberta who had been an author on Mr. Paul's paper, to take his name off the project. I think the paper is great in that it shows that morphological changes were taking place in Tyrannosaurus over the years that it existed, Drive. Currie wrote in an email. I am pretty conservative, so my preference was not to be directly involved in setting up even more species. Part of the paper's proposed impact would fall on museum collections. According to the new proposal, SU, the Field Museum's nearly complete T-Rex, is now the holotype, the specimen that anchors a species name, of Tyrannosaurus imperator. The Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History's skeleton, nicknamed the nation's T-Rex, has been anointed the holotype for Tyrannosaurus regina. Mr. Paul said he hoped museums would use the debate around his conclusions as an opportunity to educate the public about how science works. But he says they can't just ignore it, and he promises to raise a fuss if they try. The Field Museum won't be changing the labels on SU anytime soon, however. Modifications to exhibit texts are only made after new hypotheses have been vetted and widely accepted by the scientific community, Drive. O'Connor said. The new hypothesis regarding Tyrannosaurus diversity is very poorly justified and is unlikely to make it through this rigorous process.